I want to pronounce it wrong, but Sahar Ullah. She's a PhD candidate in Arabic and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, where she teaches literature humanities, and is completing her dissertation on the role of the erotic prelude of Arabic Islamic poetics.
That's a good end there.
Her research interests include classical and modern Arabic Islamic literature and representations of Muslims in late medieval and early modern European literature. At Columbia, she co-founded WAFA, and she has been selected by the New York Council for the Humanities to be a public humanities fellow for 2016-2017. Please join me to welcome Harry.
Thank you, Javier. I really appreciate I really appreciate the generosity of McNally Jackson and all of you guys here, and all of your patience as well.
So we have until 7:15. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. Javier? I don't know.
7:30.
Oh, we have. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, and what time is it, guys?
6:40.
All right, so we can do two things, and one of the suggestions that I got from a lovely person right there in the front, Lisa, is that we go into, I ask you questions, and then you read your excerpt at the end.
Yeah.
We end with that.
I'm down.
Because I think the people want to know.
Yeah.
Right, they want to know. Right?
I'm down for that.
All right, so why don't you just tell us a little bit about, we'll begin with what inspired you to write this novella, what was your, the beginning of your process of writing, and we'll start there.
Sure. I mean, part of it was, so my mom is from the Dominican Republic, my dad is from Pakistan, and I grew up Muslim in post 9/11 America. So that was an experience I wanted to bring to the world. But it was also something that, so we have this symposium at Columbia, which is going to be tomorrow, called The Muslim Protagonist, where we bring together Muslim writers from across the country and the world, and Sahar has spoken there as well. But I always felt that even though we brought so many amazing writers, there was never anything that I really felt like I was reading the experiences of people that I knew, many people in this room. So that was something in this book I just wanted to give what I believe. I think there isn't one authentic Muslim story, but I think this is I hope, a more authentic story than you'll read in mostly any other book. And this was just out of my frustration of what I was reading in school. And then also it really began as a story about my mom's crazy brother, my Uncle Tomás. My Uncle Mike right now is laughing a little bit.
I'm not the crazy one.
He's not the crazy one. And so I wanted to tell his story and his how he came to the Dominican Republic, and our family from the Dominican Republic came to Manhattan. And some of the stuff that happens is so crazy that I figured if I added a time-traveling demon, it wouldn't really make a difference.
So I think when I was reading through the novella, the autobiographical component was really clear to me, considering our conversations about your favorite novelists and the intellectuals that have inspired you, and then also conversations with your mother about who to sit next to on the train and who not to sit next to. So the thought came to my mind, what part of this is fiction, and which part is not autobiographical. And I know in terms of writing, and for those of us who write fiction, if there's anyone here who does, I mean, we eventually draw from our experiences, right? So maybe you could talk about the blurring of the lines of fiction and the autobiographical.
Sure, yeah. So the story, it is drawn from many experiences, inspired by many experiences of myself and my family and my friends. But Junot Diaz has a great line somewhere where he says that he feels that his character, your current character, Junior, is very much like him in a lot of respects. But he says that it is not him, but it feels like they're pulled from the same cloth. And I feel very similarly with the protagonist Jihad or Joe of Technologies of the Self. At the same time, the story itself is about the nature of reality. I found that when I initially wrote the story, I said, okay, this is a story about my family, about my uncle, maybe about me as well. But it's also a story about a time-traveling demon, and I know what's real and what's not. But as I continued to write and I got deeper and deeper into the process, I sort of entered this very strange place where I would write a scene and there might be one or two lines in my head I'm like, you know, this definitely happened. And one or two lines where I'm saying that I definitely made that up. But most of the story began to live somewhere in between. And even when I workshopped the story, initial drafts of the story at Columbia and at Barnard with many of my peers, they thought it was all fiction. And the parts that I knew definitely were true, they said were too unbelievable to be real. And the parts with the demon, they said, oh, no, I really feel like I'm there. But it was also about how do we conceive of reality in terms of politics as well. Within an academic context, people like Timothy Mitchell, political historian of the Middle East, or Talal Asad, who's a great anthropologist, have talked often about, sometimes there's a skepticism about whether the system exists, I think. And I think when we talk in these broad theoretical terms about some kind of holistic system of the state, of government that conditions who we are, it's very easy to be skeptical of that. And their response is that we can't always assume that the state is something we can empirically verify. It operates in sometimes ambiguous ways. And I don't think they quite meant it in this way, but I sort of took that as saying there is something non-empirical about the state, something maybe fantastical, something that we can't quite place. So inscribing it with this story about this fantasy, this demon, was a way to bring that into reality, I think. Yeah.
So let's talk about the demon.
Sure,
right?
sure.
Actually, I wanted to talk about S.H.I.E.L.D., but we could do that later.
Anyone here watching Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.?
We'll talk about it later. So the demon, Santiago, you have this really great scene where he unsheathes his sword, right? And he draws his sword and twirled it through the ambient light that seeped through the curtains. The sword was thin and long and patterned with cursive Latin, except for 3 words in block letters: liberté, equalité, fraternité. And then he whispered something about the throat of a circumcised dog. I want us to talk a little bit about Santiago and about the words inscribed on his sword. When I read that, the symbolic power of that scene, I think, for me, it took me to a place of thinking about the cutting point of what is considered modernity and the pre-modern, about blood purity, and about what is the modern state, right? And what is considered to be the ideas of enlightenment that take us away from our tradition and our past. So let's talk about his sword, and then let's talk about who Santiago is, metaphorically and also literally.
So even before we talk about the liberté, equalité, fraternité, the sword itself was inspired by the sword of Spain, which is the sword that Othello uses in Othello to wound Iago. And Iago is where Santiago comes from, James. And so that's why the last line that Othello gives before he kills himself, he says, he's talking about how he was in Aleppo once and he took by the throat a circumcised dog, and I smote him thus. So at least for me, I know oftentimes when we talk about the story of Othello, it's talked about as a complicated story. But for me, when I read it, those last few lines really, put the nail in the coffin that he kills himself because he is other, and he is ashamed of that. And for me, that was the essence of the story, is that there is something essential about who we are that is damning if you're an other. And that's something that you see repeated in so many other works of fiction. Whether it's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, there's a chapter in there about a mischievous Turk who betrays his family and whose wife converts to Christianity because she believes that she will be liberated. And so there's constantly this refrain in stories, especially in the West, that moving away from Islam, not even just Islam, but tradition and faith, is a moving away, is a move toward liberty. So those were all those dichotomies that I wanted to play with in the story. Yeah.
So the way that I read Santiago is he's able to move through time by blood and by flesh, right?
Yeah.
And by memory, right? And then something in between, right? That there's memory in the flesh. To take a term from Muslim, she's an Algerian writer, and she writes about how Arabic is inscribed in her, inside of her, right? And Santiago is interesting because he travels through this family, right? And in the novella, through the history of the family, and then it's punctuated, right? He doesn't always emerge for each character, right? He comes to Tomás, and then he comes to the protagonist. I want you to talk a little bit about how memory and flesh is a conduit for time travel.
Yeah. This was something that I just thought was coming from my own experiences. And I know we might talk about food later.
Yeah. We will talk.
Which is a very important part of
it really is.
yes. But yeah, for me, memory, when I hear my family and we sit down and we have a meal, and they all tell their stories about my friends, or about my friends or their friends, or being in the Dominican Republic, or growing up in Manhattan, in Washington Heights, or Spanish Harlem. I feel like I'm not just being told history, and in some ways not even memory. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost there, or you want to imagine yourself there. And so writing the story, for me, was, in a way, a kind of time travel. And then with the issue of flesh and the idea of blood, I was very much interested in how, I mean, for me, what does it mean to be Dominican and Pakistani? And sometimes, I know maybe this seems backwards, but I feel like there is something essential about that that I do want to hold on to, that is in some way involved genetically with who I am. But I think to reduce it to just a science would be an injustice to what it really means to be who I am.
I mean, that's what I think is really powerful about Santiago being the demon saint, right? Because he, especially with that scene and the recollection of Othello, you know, killing himself, right? He's killing the flesh of the Moor, because his conversion can never be complete, right? So about food, I mean, I'm really interested in just my own work about how we remember love in particular spaces, and I felt that in your narrative, love and memory is most strongly highlighted through the presence of food. So there's this one, I mean, there's moments where you're talking about your mom's ropa vieja, right? And also you're talking about Uncle Tomás is still eating his habichuela and plátanos after we've moved on to the dessert. And there's this wonderful scene where, you know, that everyone's eating, and that those scenes to me in an urban space were the most poignant. I felt it really, you could feel the nostalgia for a particular type of memory. So I want us to talk about the importance of food in this narrative.
Yeah, I mean, food, it's something, like I just said, where we all sit down and we share our stories. It's not just about the food, but in some ways it also is about the food. I mean, when I'm at home and my mom is cooking sancocho, which is like, it's like soup, but you just kind of just throw everything in it, but it's really good. But like I get excited about the food, right? But I'm also, in some ways it transports me in that same way I was talking about before, where it's not quite memory, it's not quite history, to memories of my grandmother, or of being in the Dominican Republic, or of being in our family apartment on 169th Street, and what it was like to be with my grandmother then. I was very young when she passed away, but I still have fleeting bits of memory, and that's something I explore a little bit in the book. But there's something about food that it's the strongest taste, right? So it's the most transporting taste. And even Al-Ghazali, he has sort of the different levels of knowledge in his philosophy, and the lowest level is sense data, what we just see, and then rationality, our rational faculties. So if we see a plane in the sky, our rational faculties tells us that it's not actually really small, it's just far away. And then the highest level of knowledge is Valk, which means fruitional experience, and it's also associated with taste, which is very interesting. Although Al-Ghazali also said that gluttony was the greatest sin, so yeah.
I'm glad you brought up Al-Ghazali because there's a moment also in the narrative where the protagonist, he's in a classroom and he has this memory of a debate, right? An intellectual debate, and Al-Ghazali is invoked. And I think it refers back to the title, right? And you told, we talked about this, and you said it was kind of like the throw your hands up in the air kind of moment when the protagonist says that the devil, Santiago or otherwise, is outside and inside, right? And you refer back to also Foucault and Foucault's idea of technologies of the self, and then from the Islamic medieval tradition, right? Ghazali's technologies of the self. So could you talk a little bit about how you came to this title and this marriage of, or not marriage, maybe a divorce of Foucault and Ghazali?
The title came directly from a very provocative line in Wael Hallaq's very provocative book, The Impossible State, which is on sort of Sharia and politics. And for those who don't know, Al-Ghazali's technologies are sort of what are the techniques and daily practices that can shape the inner self to do good in the world. So that could be everything from prayer to doing dhikr, sort of like using rosary beads, to any number of practices. Whereas for Foucault, technologies or the techniques of the state was sort of a shift from pre-modern forms of political power, where if someone, for example, is resisting a government, then the government suppresses that resistance. Whereas for Foucault, the modern form of power isn't one of suppression, but it's one where it actually produces who we are. So it similarly shapes certain habits through how we're taught in school, how work environments function, how the urban space functions, right? So that it shapes who we are internally as well. So in some ways, they're polar opposites. One is the technologies of the state that are forming us in a political way, and then there are the spiritual technologies from Ghazali and other Islamic traditions. But for me, I was very much interested in that dichotomy. And so I sort of say it's a hand in the air sort of moment, because it's very difficult to divide the two. It's hard to really separate what it means to improve the inner self, and also what it means to combat the politics of the inner self. And that's something that's very present in the protagonist, whose name is Jihad, but he goes by Joe, and you don't really figure out until around halfway through the book that his name is not actually Joe. And so something as personal as that is affected by the politics of his time.
How much of this book is, would you say, a coming-of-age narrative? I see in your introduction, right, which is outside the formal structure of the leather and flesh and fire, that everything that Uncle Tomás, that affects him to become a man, is something that happens also to the protagonist. So you say that it was 1967, she says, my mother, when her brother confronted three interlocutors and a being without definition. The first was their father, who whipped Tomás with his son's own leather belt in the musty kitchen of their Spanish Harlem apartment. The second was an older boy who lodged a pickaxe in his chest for 32 cents of pocket change. The third was Veronica, the woman next door, who invited him in and displayed her parts. The last was Santiago, the insecure demon with a cosmic grudge, who pulled him through a door of no dimension. And as we go through the narrative, we see your protagonist, he is somebody who also has to come to an understanding of who family is, right? And then violence, what is violence in his life? And sex, where does sex come in all of this? And then Santiago, right? And it's almost as if he is reenacting some of the main events that make Tomás a man. So I wanted to know how much of this novel do you see as a coming-of-age novel?
Yeah, originally the book was supposed to be just about Tomás, and then as I was writing it, I realized it was also about the narrator. Why is he so interested in telling this story? Because the story that Tomás is telling is in the 60s, when he was about the same age as the narrator. So I realized I had to write the narrator's story too, which kind of meant I had to write my story, even if it is fiction. But yeah, I did. But I never imagined it initially as a coming-of-age story. And sort of looking back on it after the fact, I mean, yeah, I guess it sort of fulfills all the requirements that you need to make it a coming-of-age story. But for me, the story really isn't even so much about coming of age or being Dominican or Pakistani or religion, although those are all what it is about. But more fundamentally, it is about the state and about politics, and how do we confront politics, and a politics that isn't just coming from outside and working down on us, but is something that is internal to who we are, that affects us in such personal ways as how we interact with our family, how we understand violence, how we understand sex, right? So politics is not this obscure abstract thing, but is incredibly personal. And in some ways it's impossible to write a coming-of-age story that isn't political in that sense.
So there's a couple love interests
Yes.
in the story. We don't know which one is fictional and which one's not. One of the love interests, or potential, she's part Iranian, I believe, right?
Iranian, all.
Or all Iranian, but
Yes.
she said she's not.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Typical Iranian.
Yeah. Right. So, and she says she's not, and then you have this line that she's troubled by her own Santiago. So I was wondering then, I mean, do you envision the Santiago as the devil of the colonized subject, or the devil of the imperial subject, or is it something, again, a mix of both?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is a bit of a mix of both. But I think of it more as of the colonized subject, because again, the creation of Santiago from an academic point of view for me was in the same way that sort of Timothy Mitchell and Talal Asad are responding to a series of academics who are looking at the colonial encounter and saying that, oh, if we just look at it as the West imposes its values or intrudes upon the rest of the world, then there's kind of no agency for the rest of the world. They're just sort of being intruded upon. But I think there's a danger in that, in rendering the power of the colonized with the power of the colonizer. And I think that the colonial encounter is fundamentally asymmetric. I mean, obviously it has done tremendous damage to the world. So for me, looking at Santiago as an asymmetric power, he's not someone that operates on everybody in the same way. I mean, he is fundamentally looking at the colonized subject and how can he, in some ways, not quite oppress them, but make them rethink who they think they are. And so I found there's something quite incestuous even about Santiago's history, that initially in Spain, during the Inquisition, he was Santiago Matamoros and Santiago Matajudios, St. James the Moor Slayer and St. James the Jew Slayer. This was in 1492, and Columbus was also there in 1492, when the same Catholic monarchs that were promoting the Inquisition then promoted him to go to the New World, to the Dominican Republic, where Santiago then took on the name of Santiago Mata Indios. And now there's a major city in almost every Latin American country named Santiago, and Santiago is a revered culture in Latino culture, a revered figure in Latino culture. So for me, there's something quite incestuous about that we sort of worship or venerate the thing that is the object of the pillaging and the destruction and the rape of our ancestors.
And I know we promised no spoilers, so I won't spoil the book. But there is a resolution, I think, right? Some kind of resolution on how to respond to maybe the self-hate or the questioning and self-doubt, right, that Santiago provokes. So read the book. There's a lot of copies here. And maybe now you can read an excerpt from the novel.
Sure. I'll read a short excerpt. This is from the first chapter. Let's see. So this is in the beginning. This is Tomás is recalling to the protagonist a time in the late 60s when Tomás was a teenager. He was around a senior in high school, and he just slapped his teacher in the ass. So he comes home and his father is waiting for him.
What page are we on?
We are on page 7. Tomás stepped into the kitchen and avoided Abuelo's gaze. Light flowed from the window, illuminating the tile floor. It was freckled black with grit and oil. "Stand in front of me," Abuelo said. Tomás shuffled until his toes were inches from Abuelo's polished black shoes. "Remove your pants," he said. Tomás unbuckled his belt and undid his jeans. The belt buckle clattered onto the tiles as the rest slumped onto the floor. He stepped out of the pile, nudging it aside. "Give me your belt," Abuelo said. Tomás knelt and slipped his belt from his jeans. He held it limply with upturned, trembling hands, like the carcass of a half-strangled snake. He kept his nose upturned and his gaze on the window. The light there was bright and clear as rays of sun in water off the coast of La Romana. He missed his island. This place was cold, black, putrid, with too much noise and no rhythm. It would not shut up. Even now it was loud. Only its constant presence in his ears had rendered this moment silent, like a roaring surf heard in the confines of a shell. This city, I realize as he tells me his story, is as restless and incessant as he was. Abuelo snatched the belt from his hands and stared back at him. Tomás saw that he had brown eyes and flat lips that matched his own, the same big hands and big feet, the same desire to tell the other off. They shared a first name, Rafael. It was why people called Tomás by his middle name. One day, he thought, he was going to fucking rule the world, ride through it and work schemes like Clint Eastwood's Blondie going town to town. Who cared what his father thought? Abuelo held his tongue, I imagine, because this was his son and he loved him. Tomás held his tongue out of rage. Why grant his father the dignity of a response? He didn't deserve to be disciplined. He never deserved to be disciplined. He deserved respect. Abuelo still wore his tie from work, but he had undone his top button. He rotated his index finger in the shape of a cone. "Turn," he said. Tomás curled his lip, but did as told. He stared through the open door and into the opposite wall of the corridor. The clothesline seemed to flicker, as if one of his siblings had twanged it from the far end. He could smell habichuela in the air, and he could hear plátanos still sizzling on the stove. If he concentrated, he could feel them sizzling, tiny reverberations in the fabric of this piece of the universe, as if he were very small and aware of the movement of every tiny thing. "And now your briefs," Abuelo commanded. Tomás blinked. He breathed for a moment before he tucked his thumbs under his sweaty white underwear and pushed it down to his ankles. His balls dangled dry and cold between his thighs. He heard the chair creak behind him as Abuelo rose. "Bend over." Tomás chewed the insides of his cheeks and focused on his toes atop the tiles. He inhaled the habichuela and plátanos. A moment passed, another, and with a grunt and a muffled whoosh, Abuelo struck him. "Yeah!" Tomás screamed. He heard Abuelo step back. "Do you know why this is happening, Tomás?" Tomás balled his fists at his knees. He was going to be the king of the world. "She was so hot," he cried. "I couldn't help it." Abuelo's voice teetered to a higher volume. "Excuse me, Tomás?" "She was so damn hot." He heard Abuelo step forward and swing. The pain came an instant later and burned. "How dare you speak back to me," Abuelo thundered. Again he swung the leather. "But she was so hot, Papa!" Smack. "She was so fucking hot!" Smack. "Papa, I couldn't help it!" Smack. "Her ass was right there, what was I?" Smack. "Ah, Papa!" Smack. "Papa!" The pain caught up with Tomás. It clung to him with urgency, singing shrilly in his ears. His back arced and his toes curled. His tongue twisted into itself, and his teeth ground against one another. For a moment, he felt that he had left his body. First, he believed he was in his abuelo's body, delivering his own wounds. And then the body of the light from the window behind him, old and waning as the day completed itself. And then he was in the clothesline, vibrating, pulsing, flickering to a rapid beat, jazz maybe, or bachata, but bereft of melody, all drums. He jerked his head as if from a pool of cold water and discovered himself in his own body again, neck craned upward, staring into the hall. He heard Abuelo's footsteps fade into an adjacent room. Mi hijo, Abuelo whispered. Something black slipped from the clothesline, the tip of a boot, big as an ogre's, then a thick, armored pant leg sealed to the boot, followed by half a torso and arm, the blade of a sword, and a morillon with its visor lowered. The rest of the body fell through the clothesline, moving impossibly into 3 dimensions, like a beam of light split in all trajectories. The figure knelt in the doorway, and at last Tomás could discern what it was. A knight in shining armor, suited in black and kneeling, as tall as the doorframe. The figure reeked of gasoline. The knight rested his forearm on his upright knee, and with his free hand lifted his visor. It clanked. Beneath was a sheath of stained glass and a breathing apparatus. He punched a rusted protrusion beneath his chin. The apparatus exhaled and the glass slipped away, revealing blue eyes, bushy brown eyebrows, and thin lips adorned with a generous, vibrant red mustache. He made a point of smiling. Hello, Tomás. Didn't think I'd find you? He spoke Spanish like a Spaniard, steady and formal, and at first Tomás did not understand his accent. The knight looked over Tomás's shoulder and shrugged. His garments banged and scraped against one another. He smirked. Was her ass worth yours?
So how are we for time? What time is it? 7:11? Great. So I think we have some time for questions from the audience, and I'd like to give you guys a chance to, I mean, if you've read the book, if you have any questions about it, again, no spoilers, or if you have any questions of Harris as a writer. There's, yes.
Yeah. Harris. I've been thinking a lot about the, as a Jewish man, the internalization of oppression across generations and the way that it's transmitted not only through acts of the state, but through behavioral patterns within the family. And I'm curious how you think about that, maybe perhaps in your own family, but also in your character, you know, given, you know, the past traumas of colonialism, but also the present in the United States post 9/11.
Yeah, that was something I struggled with in writing the story, because especially with the first chapter of the book has many beatings and many events like that. So it is how do we understand this behavioral problem? And when we tell these stories at our family dinners, everybody sort of laughs, and it's a very funny story. But when I was workshopping it, you know, with peers, I actually had to cut some scenes because it was seen as too cruel. But for us, we're like, oh, you know, white people are too soft, maybe. But I mean, something I hope that comes out towards the end of the book is that, I mean, there is a reason that the parents are acting in this way. That they're here in a new country. They don't quite know all the rules. So you do have these behavioral things that pop up. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't want to quite spoil the end of the book either. But you sort of realize toward the end that there is a reason that, again, has very much to do with the devil, about why they're so tough with their children. and it's because they're in this new country. And I think that's something a lot of immigrant parents deal with is, you know, you're in this place that's very foreign as much as you seem foreign to everybody else. And especially for my Uncle Tomás that this is about, he had meningitis when he was a child. And so he was mute until he was 7 years old. And all the words he learned were from sort of the kids on the street in the DR. So they're all like all these bad words and but that sort of conditions how he is. I mean, now he was arrested for undisclosed reasons that you can read the book. But now, I mean, now he's like living somewhere in the Bronx in someone's basement. And so it's very hard to put the blame on any one person. We're all subjects of our circumstances in some way. I don't know if I answered your question perfectly, but.
So I guess it's a good transition that you just mentioned that he had been mute for a few years. I'm curious as to how you reconcile narrating in English words that the character or is listening in Spanish, and whether the narrator is thinking in Spanish or in English, or Tomás is thinking in Spanish and in English, and like how do you transmit that? And I know Juno Diaz talks about it a lot, like how he's not fully English and he's not fully Spanish, and it's a weird lingo. And I'm curious as to what your experience of narrating this family history that was probably told to you in Spanish at parts came about.
Yeah. Actually, my Spanish is very poor, unfortunately. So it was mostly actually told to me in English, and maybe some bits of Spanish here and there. But yeah, I mean that was it's a line that you have to straddle in terms of how much do you want to tell it in the native tongue versus in English, and it's a matter of, you know, how much do you want to force your audience to do the extra legwork. I think for me, part of the reason that a lot of it is in English is because I know English better as a language. It's something I think in more, and I think because of that, it's also something my protagonist thinks in more often as well. But yeah.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could just tell us some about your writing process, like how long it took. Do you write in the middle of the night? And also, I always wonder, like what it's like to write something in which it's very apparent that it's autobiographical or about people you know. Do you show them a first draft first, or is it a surprise? You know?
Some of it is a surprise. But yeah, I mean, for me, when I wrote it, I had in mind, like, yes, I am inspired by these real experiences, but in my mind, I was seeing it just as a work of fiction, because otherwise I would have been too bound to just following exactly everything that happened, you know, like bit by bit. And so really, like, from just in my mind, I was approaching it always as, you know, this is made up, as much as it's inspired by things in the world. And then in terms of process, my process is very erratic. Sometimes I write best in the middle of the night, but I don't always do that. I try to write at normal hours when I can. And then it's also very difficult being also in school, or I can imagine for other people being at work. It's really hard to find the time to write. And in some cases, it feels like a bit of privilege that you even have the time to put words to paper.
I started reading your book, haven't finished it yet, but I started reading it off the heels of reading Out of the Unseen, which I'm almost finished.
Yeah.
So of course, Out of the Unseen has a prominent mystical character, the Jiggy character in that book, and I, so I was wondering how, if you were inspired by that kind of construction, and then also, as I think further about it, I know that I think about also Abu Mus's Woman Eaters, which I love that book, and there's there's a wise guy who's like a mystical character who you don't hear from him, but you hear of him. And so I was wondering, along with what was your inspiration for how you were going to incorporate this mystical character, but then also does that to you kind of bring in a kind of reality that is oftentimes not spoken about, because I think oftentimes people who kind of think on spiritual terms do recognize that there's some, or feel there is some kind of spiritual component or unseen character that is playing, that is in the mix. So it's like about how you decide to.
Yeah, it was something. All of the Unseen. I love All of the Unseen. Such a great book. So that, I mean, that was a bit of an inspiration. But it's actually hard for me to really think of something that really. I mean, I guess the book that did lean me a little bit in going in this direction of inserting these fantastical characters was Octavia Butler's book. The one that's about the, I'm forgetting if it was Pattern Master or Lilith's Brood, but she has a series of books about these two characters, and one of them, it starts out in like pre-modern Africa, and these two characters are sort of in different tribes in different areas, and one of them, he's a bit of like a devil character, and he, what he does is he occupies a body, and then when he's done with the body, he enters another body, and then the body he left dies. And so that he lives forever. And the other one is a shapeshifter. And she lives forever. And she's usually a healer, so she'll usually enter a village and she'll stay there for a generation or two and heal and bring the community together. Whereas the other guy is more of he likes to gather people together for political or military purposes. So it starts out in sort of pre-modern Africa, and then it builds toward sort of colonialism and slavery. And it's interesting how, because they can shift personalities, they can be both slaves but also slave masters. And then eventually it ends up in colonial America, and you kind of get a bit of an X-Men scenario where they're trying to sort of bring together, there are other mutant-like people, and they try to bring them together. But I really love the way Butler was able to play with the colonial experience using something that was somewhere between sci-fi and fantasy, and I like that room in between, because science fiction sometimes, I love sci-fi, but I don't quite believe in science. And I know I sound a little backward there, but science really, by philosophers of science, we haven't really decided what it means, if it's inductive or deductive or empirical or philosophical.
Did you have a question, Theo, again?
Well, I guess a question, kind of more of a comment. It just amazes me, you know, you kind of mentioned kind of time travel. I think, you know, you do your time travel through your food. You know, I mean, because every time I have great memories of your grandmother, it really has to do with food. You know, it amazes me how I sit with my family, you know, the cousins, and we sit at the table, and your grandmother often comes up because we smell something, and it just takes us there, you know. And the other thing about, you know, with Tomás, his demon, from the minute I read it, you know, I don't know, I mean, I don't know too much, but I started really thinking about Don Quixote, you know.
Absolutely.
You know, and not that I've read really, you know, but it just takes me there, and you know, I saw it. Yeah, it's his demon. You know, because I'm sure he had quite a few of them. You know.
Yes.
I actually also thought of Don Quixote when I was reading, because you're in between Tomás's crazy, but also his fantasy. Like this, maybe he's the one who knows everything, and everyone else is crazy, right? Maybe one more question, Lisa. Did you?
I was just wondering. I love the book, and I'm so happy to see you. You're such a busy guy, Harris. Are you going to have time to keep writing? And what are you working on now? And
I hope to have more time to keep writing. I think a part of me would die inside if I didn't. Isaac Asimov, who's my idol, who also did everything. He was a biochemist, a PhD science writer, but he said if writing is like, he said something like writing is like breathing, and if I stopped, I would die. But yeah, I do want to continue writing this story. This was initially meant to be just one chapter of a book, and I was approaching it as a short story. And each of the chapters in this thing was supposed to be a little vignette, and it just became bigger. So there is much more to tell.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Thank you, Harris. Thank you for giving this to us. And thank you, everyone, for coming and for your wonderful questions. We have books here. Harris will be signing them. Please buy one. And I hope you enjoy the reading.